The ocean is usually full of noise, static, engine thrum, the routine chatter of captains navigating the trade routes. But on a stifling afternoon in June 1947, the airwaves over the Strait of Malacca turned into a nightmare. This is one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, a choke point between Sumatra and Malaysia where thousands of vessels pass every year. It's a place of pirates, sudden storms, and during the post-war years, lingering danger. But on this specific day, the danger wasn't a mine. It wasn't a torpedo. It was something invisible. Two American ships, the City of Baltimore and the Silver Star, along with British and Dutch listening posts, suddenly picked up a frantic distress signal. It was coming from a Dutch firefighter, the SS Ourang Medan. The Morse code didn't follow standard protocol. The hand on the key was shaky, erratic. The operator wasn't just asking for help. He was broadcasting a horror story in real time. The message decoded to this: all officers including captain dead in chat room and on bridge, possibly whole crew dead. Then a long, terrifying series of dots and dashes, unintelligible gibberish. It was the sound of a man losing his mind or his life while his finger was still on the trigger. The listening posts waited. The static hissed. Then one final message cut through the noise. Two words typed out clearly with a chilling finality that has haunted maritime history for 80 years. I die. Then silence. This is the story exactly as it was first told in the late 1940s. A tale that has terrified sailors and readers ever since, even though no official record of the ship has ever been found in Lloyd's register or Dutch shipping archives. When rescuers finally found the vessel drifting aimlessly under the tropical sun, there was no damage, no smoke, no signs of a struggle. But what they found on deck wasn't just a tragedy, it was an impossibility. This is the story of the SS Ourang Medan, the ship that screamed and then vanished. To understand why this mystery is so terrifying, you first have to understand where it happened. The Strait of Malacca isn't just open ocean. It is a choke point. It's a narrow, congested and treacherous 500-mile stretch of water between the Indonesian island of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. For centuries, this has been the jugular vein of global trade. If you want to move cargo from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, you have to squeeze through here. But in June of 1947, this water was more dangerous than usual. The world was still sweeping up the broken glass of World War II. The waters of the South Pacific were littered with the rogue naval mines that had broken loose from their moorings. Piracy was rampant in the chaotic post-war economy. Ships vanished here all the time, usually from loose wartime mines or post-war pirates. But this time the distress call mentioned no damage, no attack, just death. That is what the captain of the American merchant ship, the Silver Star, was expecting when he altered course. He had heard the screaming SOS. He had triangulated the coordinates. He knew there was a ship in the distress, and the code of the sea is absolute. You answer the call. The Silver Star pushed its engines to the limit, racing toward the last known position of the Ourang Medan. The crew on deck scanned the horizon, expecting to see a column of black smoke from a fire or the debris of a sinking vessel. They expected chaos. Instead, they found absolute stillness. Through the shimmering heat haze of the afternoon sun, the Ourang Medan appeared. It was a Dutch freighter, seemingly intact. It wasn't listing. It wasn't burning. It was just sitting there. But to a sailor's eyes, something was wrong immediately. The ship was rolling gently with swell, but it felt heavy, lethargic. There was no smoke rising from the funnel, which meant the engines were cold. There was no wash around the bow. The Silver Star closed the distance. They came alongside, dangerously close, their engines rumbling in the quiet air. The captain ordered his crew to hail the Dutch ship. They blew the ship's whistle, a deafening blast that should have rattled the windows of the Medan's bridge. No movement. They used signal lamps to flash Morse code directly at the wheelhouse. No response. They tried the radio again. Static. The Ourang Medan was floating in one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth, under a bright tropical sun, looking perfectly seaworthy. But there wasn't a single soul on deck, no lookout, no maintenance crew, no captain. The only thing moving was the Dutch flag, snapping lazily in the breeze. The crew of the Silver Star lined the railing, staring across the gap of water. An uneasy feeling started to spread through the ranks. It wasn't just that the ship was quiet. It was that the silence felt wrong. It was the silence of a tomb. The captain lowered his binoculars. He knew that what he had to do. If the radio operator was dead and the captain was dead, as the message claimed, then who was steering the ship? He gave the order to prepare a boarding party. They were going over. The gap of water between the two ships was only a few hundred yards, but it felt like crossing into another world. The captain of the Silver Star selected a small team of his toughest men. They lowered a lifeboat into the choppy swell of the Malacca Strait. As they rowed away from the safety of the Silver Star, the Ourang Medan loomed above them, a rusted wall of iron, silent and imposing. This is a specific sound a dead ship makes. Usually you hear the hum of generators, the clank of machinery, or the shouting of men. Here the only sound was the ocean slapping against the hull. The boarding party reached the side. They hooked a Jacob's ladder onto the rail and began the climb. One by one, they pulled themselves up, boots scrambling for perches on the wet rungs. The first sailor crested the railing and stepped onto the deck. He froze. The sun was hammering down. It was a scorching June afternoon in the tropics, likely over 100 degrees Fahrenheit on the steel deck. But the men reported an instant, unnatural sensation the moment they boarded. It felt cold, an unnatural chill that no thermometer registered, but every man felt in his bones. The first thing they saw, according to the most vivid accounts that circulated in the 1950s and 60s, was the ship's dog, a German Shepherd, frozen mid-snot, dead on its feet with no wound. Its lips were pulled back in a growl. Its teeth were bayed at something unseen. The boarding party drew their weapons. They fanned out, moving slowly toward the bridge. The deck was scorching hot to the touch, radiating the heat of the sun, yet the air felt thin and metallic. There was no smell of decay, not yet. There was no smell of gunpowder or smoke. There was only the smell of the sea and something else. Something faint, like sulfur or rotten eggs, drifting up from the cargo holds. "Hello!" one of the Americans shouted. His voice echoed of the steel bulkheads. And died instantly. They moved past the winches and the cargo hatches. Every door was open. Every light was off. The ship seemed to be holding its breath. The team split up. One group headed for the engine room to check the boilers. The other group, led by the first mate, headed straight for the bridge to find the captain. They had no idea that they were walking into a graveyard. The deeper the boating party moved into the ship, the more the silence began to scream. On the main deck, spread out amidst the winches and the cargo hatches, lay the Dutch crew. They weren't piled together as if they had been fighting. They weren't huddled in corners as if they were hiding. They were scattered, dropped exactly where they had stood. But it was their expressions that stopped the Americans in their tracks. Some lay with hands clamped over their ears. Others clawed at their own throats. Many had arms raised, fingers pointing vaguely toward the sky, as if warding off something descending from above. The first mate of the Silver Star knelt beside one body. He checked for a pulse. Nothing. He checked for wounds. There were none. No knife marks, no bullet holes, no signs of blunt force trauma. Their skin was unbroken, yet their faces were twisted into masks of absolute agony and terror. It was the same story on the bridge. When the team kicked open the door to the wheelhouse, they found the captain. He was lying on the floor, his uniform pressed, his cape nearby. His eyes were bulging, fixed on the ceiling as if staring at something unbearable. The helmsman was slumped over the wheel, his hands still gripping the spokes, his face turned toward the port window, frozen in that same rictus of horror. The radio operator was slumped in his chair. His hand was still on the sending key. He hadn't even had time to recoil. Whatever had killed him had taken him mid-transmission. Like the others, his eyes were wide, staring at something the boarding party couldn't see. Down in the bowels of the ship, the engineering team found the same nightmare. The stokers were dead in front of the boilers. The oilers were dead on the catwalks. Even deep inside the hull, shielded by layers of steel, the expressions were identical. Terror. The Americans moved through the ship like ghosts, their boots clanking on the metal, their breath catching in their throats. The ship was a tomb, but it was a fresh one. The bodies weren't decomposing yet. There was no smell of rot, but there was something else, a pervasive, unnatural chill in the air. Despite the boiler room usually being the hottest place on a vessel, the first mate returned to the deck, pale and shaken. He signaled to the captain across the water. "No survivors," he shouted, his voice cracking. "They are all dead." And Captain, they all died looking at the sky. It defied logic. If it was pirates, they would have been shot. If it was a storm, they would have been battered. If it was food poisoning, they would be sick in their bunks. Instead, an entire crew of hardened sailors had dropped dead simultaneously, terrified of something that left no trace. The captain knew he couldn't leave the ship there. It was a hazard to navigation, and under maritime law, he had a claim to salvage. If he could tow the Ourang Medan to port, the payout would be massive. He ordered a tow line to be rigged. The crew of the Silver Star began the heavy work of attaching a hawser to the bow of the ghost ship. They wanted to get away from those staring eyes. But the Ourang Medan wasn't done with them yet. As the Americans secured the line, a wisp of smoke curled up from the number 4 cargo hold. It wasn't the black smoke of an engine. It was thick, acrid, and chemical. The ship was waking up. The plan was simple. Secure a tow line to the bow of the Ourang Medan, drag the silent freighter to the nearest port, and claim the salvage rights. It was standard procedure. It was business. But the ocean had other plans. As the boarding party from the Silver Star finished securing the heavy hawser line to the Dutch ship's bitts, a sailor noticed something drifting up from the deck plates. It started as a whisper, a thin grey ribbon of smoke curling up from the darkness of hatch number 4. At first, it looked like steam, but then the smell hit them. It wasn't the smell of burning wood or oil. It was acrid, chemical. It stung the eyes and burned the throat. The captain of the Silver Star, watching from the bridge, saw the wisp turn into a plume. He grabbed the megaphone. "Get off that ship," he bellowed. "Now, abandon the tow. Get back." The boarding party didn't need to be told twice. The uneasy feeling they had carried since stepping aboard suddenly turned into blind panic. They scrambled back down the Jacob's ladder, dropping into their large boat with a desperation that bordered on frenzy. They rowed hard, muscle straining, putting as much water as possible between themselves and the ghost ship. They had barely reached the side of the Silver Star when the smoke turned black. "Cut the line," the captain ordered. On the stern of the Silver Star, deckhands swung axes. The heavy tow rope snapped with a crack like a whip. The American ship reversed engines, the water churning to white foam as they backed away, retreating to a safe distance. They were just in time. Minutes later, the Ourang Medan didn't just catch fire, it detonated. A massive explosion ripped through the hull from the inside out. Witness described a pillar of fire shooting into the sky, dropping the sun. Steel plates were torn like paper. Debris rained down across the strait, splashing into the waves like hail. The shark wave hit the Silver Star, rattling the teeth of the crew. Then silence returned. The Ourang Medan, broken and burning, began to slide backward. It didn't sink slowly. It plummeted. With a terrifying groan of twisting metal, the stern rose and the ship slipped beneath the surface. Within moments, the whirlpool subsided. The bubbles stopped. The ocean surface smoothed over as if nothing had happened. Or so the story goes, because no wreckage was ever recovered, and no official report from the Silver Star confirms the explosion. The ship was gone. The bodies were gone. The logbook was gone. The crew of the Silver Star was left alone in the middle of the Strait of Malacca, staring at an empty patch of blue water. They had the story. They had the memory of the frozen faces, but they had absolutely no evidence. The Ourang Medan had taken its secret to the bottom. The Silver Star limped back to port with a ghost story that sounded impossible. A ship full of dead men with no wounds, a dog frozen in a growl, and then a spontaneous explosion that destroyed all the evidence. The maritime authorities were skeptical. The insurers were baffled. But in the decades since, one of the most persistent theories, drawn from later accounts, chemical speculation, and researchers like those citing old German publications, explains almost everything. The Ourang Medan wasn't haunted. It was a floating bomb. To understand the death of the crew, you have to look at what they might have been carrying. Official records of the Ourang Medan are notoriously hard to find. We'll get to why later, but persistent rumors suggest the ship was a smuggler, and its hold wasn't full of grain or textiles. It was allegedly carrying massive, unregistered shipment of two specific chemicals, potassium cyanide and nitroglycerine. According to accounts that emerged in the 50s and later, let's look at the chemistry. Potassium cyanide is stable when it's dry. But the hull of a cargo ship in 1947 wasn't a sterile lab environment. It was a rusted, sweating steel box in the middle of our ocean. If seawater had leaked into the hold, a common occurrence in the choppy Strait of Malacca, and reacted with cyanide, the result would have been catastrophic. The mixture creates hydrogen cyanide gas. The gas is an invisible killer. It creates a toxic fog that rises. Imagine the timeline. A seal breaks in the hold below. The gas begins to seep through the vents, silent and odorless at first. It hits the lower decks. The stokers and oilers down in the engine room are the first to drop. Then the gas races to the crew quarters. It floods the bridge. Hydrogen cyanide interferes with the body's ability to use oxygen. It causes histotoxic hypoxia. Basically, your blood is full of oxygen, but your cells can't access it. You suffocate from the inside out. The symptoms match the scene in key ways: sudden collapse, panic, gasping, eyes bulging in terror as the world goes black. Victims would feel overwhelming dread, muscles seizing in a final spasm of fear. They wouldn't have time to run. They would collapse right where they stood. While the match isn't perfect, hydrogen cyanide acts fast, often without prolonged screaming or the dramatic arms raised poses. It fits the sudden, terrified death better than most alternatives, including the lake of wounds and the dog's frozen snarl. This explains the radio operator dying mid-sentence. But what about the explosion? That brings us to the second chemical. Nitroglycerin is notoriously unstable. It doesn't like heat, it doesn't like movement, and it definitely doesn't like being stored next to a corrosive gas leak. As the Silver Star tried to tow the ship, the friction or the chemical reaction likely caused a spark in the volatile cargo. They first started slow. The smoke the boarding party saw and then hit the critical mass of nitroglycerin. Boom! The ship didn't just sink, it was vaporized by its own contraband. This theory wraps the mystery in a neat scientific bow. It explains the deaths, the terror, and the destruction. Yet even this tidy explanation raises questions about why such a dangerous cargo would be undocumented on an unregistered ship. That leads us to a much darker possibility. If the chemical theory describes a tragic accident, a darker, more conspirational theory ties the ship to the aftermath of the World War II and one of the war's most horrific secrets. To understand why a Dutch freighter might be scrubbed from history, we have to look at the date again, June 1947. World War II had ended 2 years earlier, but the Shadow War was just beginning. The United States and the Soviet Union were in a race to seize the technological secrets of the fallen Axis powers. We know about Operation Paperclip, where the US government secretly brought Nazi rocket scientists to America. But there was a darker, less publicized equivalent in the Pacific. Enter Unit 731. This was the Imperial Japanese Army's covered biological and chemical warfare research unit, based in occupied China near Harbin. Led by General Shiro Ishii, it conducted some of the most horrific experiments in human history. Deliberate infections with plague, anthrax, cholera, vivisections without anesthesia, frostbite tests, and development of plague bombs, nerve agents, and other weapons tested on thousands of prisoners, mostly Chinese civilians and prisoners of wars. When Japan surrendered in 1945, General Douglas MacArthur and US forces made a controversial deal: immunity from prosecution for the scientists of Unit 731 in exchange for the research data on biological and chemical warfare. But you can't just mail biological weapons through the post office. You have to move them discreetly. While no direct evidence links the Ourang Medan to Unit 731, the timing, 1947, amid secret transfers of Axis research and the lack of any shipping records fuel the idea that this could have been a cover transport of experimental agents or wartime stocks of nerve agents from China or Japan towards US hands or black market buyers. Think about the route. The ship was traveling through the Strait of Malacca, likely heading away from ports in the former Japanese-occupied territories. If the cargo hold contained unstable canisters of an experimental nerve agent, something far more potent than standard cyanide, a leak would explain the instant, terrified death of the crew. Nerve agents attack the central nervous system. They cause violent muscle spasms, paralysis, suffocation, and overwhelming panic. Victims lose control of their bodies almost immediately, collapsing where they stood, conscious but unable to move, their faces frozen in a rectus of agony as their diaphragms failed. This explains the lack of blood. It explains the fear etched on every face. It explains why the radio operator couldn't finish his message. But most importantly, it explains the silence after the fact. If the Ourang Medan was carrying a secret shipment tied to Unit 731's work, it would never be registered in Lloyd's of London. It wouldn't have a paper trail. The crew would be mercenaries or smugglers, paid in cash to ask no questions. And if something went wrong, if a canister breached in the tropical heat, the ship becomes a floating biohazard. When the Silver Star arrived, they weren't just boarding a derelict vessel, they were walking onto what could have been a crime scene involving the darkest secrets of the war. And the explosion? Perhaps the agents were unstable in tropical heat, degrading into something volatile. Or perhaps the ship was rigged to self-destruct at the first sign of compromise, erasing evidence that could cause an international incident. When the Ourang Medan sank, it didn't just take the bodies of the crew. If true, it erased potentially damning proof of wartime atrocities handed to new hands. But there is one final problem with all of this. One nagging detail that skeptics use to tear the whole story apart. We have the distress call, we have the testimony of the Silver Star crew, but if you look for the Ourang Medan in the history books, you won't find it. To believe the story of the SS Ourang Medan, you have to accept a lot of impossible things. But the hardest thing to swallow isn't the frozen bodies or the explosion. It's the ship itself. If you go to Lloyd's Register of Shipping, the ultimate authority on every merchant vessel in the world since 1764, and you search for the SS Ourang Medan, you will find a blank page. No ship by that name was ever officially registered. No construction blueprints exist. No company claimed ownership. To the skeptics, this is the smoking gun. They argue that the entire event is a fossil yawn, a sailor's ghost story invented in a bar in Singapore or Surabaya and embellished over decades of retelling. They point that Ourang Medan translates from Malay to Main from Medan, a city in Sumatra. It sounds less like a proper ship's name and more like a generic placeholder, a John Doe of the sea. Furthermore, some researchers have dug into the details of the Silver Star. While the Silver Star was a real American merchant vessel, its official's logbook for June 1947 don't mention any detour for a rescue mission in the Strait of Malacca. They show it sailing in a different part of the ocean entirely during that period. The story origins are also inconsistent. The earliest printed accounts appear in 1948 Dutch-Indonesian newspaper, Die Locomotive and others, like Die Locomotive and others. But some versions date the incident as early as 1940, with varying locations, ship names, and details. The 1947 date and the dramatic Morse messages solidified only in later retellings, particularly after the Vincent Gaddis and others popularized the tale in the 1950s and 60s. So, case closed. A complete myth? Not quite. Because there is a paper trail, just not the kind that proves the ship existed. In May 1952, the United States Coast Guard published a short article in the Proceedings of the Merchant Marine Council. It cited the Ourang Medan's tragedy as a cautionary example of the dangers of transporting hazardous materials at sea. They treated it as a historical incident, not a campfire story, though they presented it without primary documentation or survivor affidavits. And then there is the logic of the smuggler. If you are a captain hired to move illegal chemical weapons, unregistered cyanide, or wartime contraband through a post-war hard zone, would you register your ship? Would you file a manifest? Would you leave a trail that Lloyd's or other maritime authorities could follow? Of course not. You would paint over the real name. You would use a false call sign. You would become a ghost before you even left the dock. The absence of records doesn't prove the ship never existed. It might just prove that this mission was so illegal or so sensitive that it was never meant to be found. Yet the weight of the inconsistencies is heavy. No wreck, no debris field, no corroborating logs from any listening post, no named survivors from the Silver Star giving sworn testimony. When you strip away the embellishments, what remains is a compelling tale, but one built on shifting sand. After all the theories, accident, conspiracy, hoax, we return to where we began. A final Morse message cutting through static on a hot afternoon in June 1947. Whether this was a terrifying industrial accident, a cocktail of seawater, potassium cyanide, and nitroglycerine that suffocated a crew and vaporized the evidence, or a darker cover-up involving the shadows of World War II and biological weapons that were never meant to exist. Or perhaps exactly what the sailors still whisper about in the bars of Singapore, Jakarta, and Trieste. A ghost story, a warning spun too tall, embellished over decades until it became legend. We will likely never know the truth. The logbook is gone, the bodies are gone, the hull, if it ever existed, lies somewhere at the bottom of the Malacca Strait under 300 feet of crushing water and 80 years of silt. If you could go down there today amidst the coral and the currents, you might find the rusted skeleton of a Dutch freighter. You might find the twisted metal of the November 4 hold, but you won't find the answers. The ocean is vast, and it's very good at keeping its secrets. The Ourang Medan screamed for help. It showed us its horror, and then it took the truth to the grave. The only thing that remains is that final chilling transmission. A message sent by a dying man, tapping out a warning to a world that arrived too late. 2 words, they still echo across the decades. I die.
Rusted skeleton, twisted metal. You won't find the answers. The ocean is vast. It keeps its secrets. The truth to the grave. Final chilling transmission. A warning to a world that arrived too late. I die.